She didn't cry when he threw the divorce papers across the marble floor. She didn't scream when he told the entire room, his generals, his lawyers, his cold-eyed lieutenants, that she had never been anything more than a convenience. She simply picked up the ring she had worn for 3 years, placed it beside his whiskey glass, and said the 7 words that would haunt Dante Marcello for the rest of his life. "I hope your empire keeps you warm." And then Amara walked out. No suitcase. No goodbye. No tears. Just the quiet devastation of a woman who had finally accepted the truth, that she had spent 3 years loving a man who mistook her grace for weakness, her silence for submission, and her loyalty for something he could afford to waste. What Dante Marcello did not know, as he watched her walk through those mahogany doors for the last time, was that the moment she left, something inside him left with her. Not his power, not his empire, something far more irreplaceable, his peace. And a man without peace is not an emperor. He is simply a prisoner inside a very expensive cage. Amara Baptiste had never been the kind of woman who chased anyone. Not as a girl growing up in New Orleans, where her grandmother raised her on 3 things: grace, dignity, and the understanding that a woman who knows her worth never has to negotiate it. Not as a young woman who worked her way through architectural school with steady hands and a quiet fire. And not as the wife of Dante Marcello, a man whose name made grown men lower their voices in every city from Milan to Manhattan. She had married him knowing exactly what he was. She simply believed, with the particular foolishness of a woman deeply in love, that what they had was real enough to survive what he was. She was wrong. 3 years. 1,094 days of carefully learning his silences. Of understanding that when Dante went cold, it wasn't hatred. It was fear wearing the costume of control. She had cooked for a man who rarely came home, stood beside him at events where he introduced her to powerful men with a hand on her back that felt more like ownership than affection. She had absorbed his moods like architecture absorbs weather, silently, structurally, without collapsing. And still, she had loved him. Not the empire, not the power, not the untouchable legend that men whispered about. She had loved the version of Dante that only existed at 3 a.m., when the guards were dismissed, the phones were off, and he sat on the penthouse balcony staring at a city he ruled but could not feel. That version of him had held her once like she was the only real thing in a world built on violence and pretense. But that version came less and less, until it stopped coming entirely. The divorce papers were not a surprise. They were a conclusion. What surprised her was how deeply unbothered she felt, and how deeply that unbothered feeling frightened her. Because it meant she had already done her grieving. Quietly. Alone. In a marriage that was still technically alive. She had mourned Dante Marcello while he was still sleeping beside her. And the woman who walked out of that room was not broken. She was finished. Dante Marcello had been called many things. Ruthless. Untouchable. A ghost in a tailored suit. The kind of man who negotiated with silence and ended disagreements with a single look that made rooms go cold. He had built the Marcello empire from the wreckage his father left behind, all blood and bad debts, and turned it into something architectural, precise, feared. In 7 years, he had expanded across 4 continents, eliminated 3 rival families without a single public trace, and accumulated a kind of power that even governments acknowledged quietly, in rooms with no cameras. He did not feel guilt. He did not feel doubt. He had trained those out of himself at 19, the night he held his younger brother's body in an alley in Palermo and made a decision. That grief was a luxury he could not afford. That feeling too deeply would get him killed. That the only safe emotion was none at all. He had lived by that decision for 14 years. Until Amara. She had entered his life as an architectural consultant hired to redesign the Marcello estate's private wing, and she had walked through his world with a calm that unnerved him completely. She didn't flinch at his coldness, didn't perform discomfort around his guards. She measured walls, took notes, and spoke to him exactly the way she spoke to everyone else, directly, with quiet intelligence, and zero appetite for his intimidation. He had married her 8 months later. Not because he understood what he felt for her, because she was the first thing in 14 years that made him feel anything. And a man who has been numb that long will burn his entire life down to stay near a source of warmth. But Dante Marcello did not know how to love without control. He did not know how to be close without dominating, How to be vulnerable without feeling endangered. How to let someone in without building walls around them instead of himself. So he kept her beautiful and kept her distant. Gave her luxury instead of presence. Gave her security instead of truth. And told himself it was enough. He was standing at his office window when Marco, his most trusted lieutenant, told him she had left the building without her luggage. Dante didn't move. Should we follow her, sir? A long silence. No. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat down at a desk covered in empires, and felt, for the first time since Palermo, absolutely nothing. He told himself that meant he was fine. He was wrong. The penthouse had never been loud. But in the weeks after Amara left, Dante understood for the first time the difference between a space that is quiet and a space that is empty. She had not taken much. Her clothes. A few books. The small framed photograph of her grandmother that had sat on the nightstand beside their bed. Such a small collection of objects for 3 years of life. It was almost insulting, not to her, but to him, that everything she needed from this life fit into 2 bags. That nothing he had given her, not the penthouse, not the cars, not the jewelry she wore to events like armor, had been irreplaceable to her. He sat at breakfast alone and noticed she had rearranged the kitchen months ago in a way that made it more efficient, and that without understanding why, he had been benefiting from her thoughtfulness every single morning. He sat in meetings and caught himself turning to say something to the empty chair where she occasionally sat when he allowed her near his world, before remembering. He walked into the private wing she had designed and stood in the hallway she had rebuilt from a dark, narrow corridor into something with high ceilings and warm light that made you feel, inexplicably, less alone. She had built him a home while he was busy building an empire. And he had been so convinced that empire was the important thing. Marco noticed. Of course Marco noticed. The man had served beside Dante for 9 years and could read his silences like weather patterns. She called her grandmother. Marco said one morning, setting down a report. She's in New Orleans. Staying in the family house. Dante didn't look up from his documents. I didn't ask. No, you didn't. Marco paused at the door. You've also barely eaten in 11 days. But I didn't mention that either. He left. Dante stared at the unsigned document in his hands. He had not noticed he was barely eating. He noticed now. New Orleans in late October smelled like chicory and river water and something ancient that the city had never bothered to name. Amara sat on her grandmother's porch the way she had sat there as a child, legs folded beneath her, coffee going cold in her hands, watching the street with the particular attention of someone learning to be still again. Her grandmother, Celeste Baptiste, 73 years old, the kind of woman whose gentleness had the structural integrity of iron, said nothing for a long time. Then, you're not broken. Amara looked at her. I know. Then why do you look like someone who thinks she should be? A long pause. Down the street, a child chased a dog through orange leaves. Because I gave everything I had, Amara said quietly. And it still wasn't enough. And I know. That's about him, not me. I know that. She turned the cold coffee cup in her hands. But knowing something and feeling something are different roads. And I'm still walking between them. Celeste nodded slowly. Your grandfather was a complicated man. Amara looked up. Proud. Closed. Thought love was something you demonstrated through provision, not presence. The old woman's eyes were steady. I almost left him. Twice. A pause. The first time, I stayed because I was afraid. The second time, I stayed because he asked me, really asked me, got on his knees on this very porch, and asked. Silence. And Dante? Celeste asked. Amara's jaw was soft. Her eyes, clear. Dante doesn't know how to kneel. She picked up her coffee. And I can't teach him. That's his journey, not mine. Celeste watched her granddaughter for a long moment. This woman who had walked out of a Marcello empire with 2 bags and her dignity intact, and felt something loosen in her chest. Something that had been tight since the phone call 3 weeks ago. You're going to be all right, Celeste said. Amara looked at the street. I already am. It happened at 2:47 a.m. Dante was in his private office, the one only Marco had access to, surrounded by contracts that required his signature and a glass of whiskey that had gone warm 3 hours ago. The city stretched below him in its indifferent, glittering entirety. He had been staring at the same paragraph for 40 minutes. He didn't understand why he couldn't concentrate. He had always been able to concentrate. His ability to compartmentalize was legendary, the thing men in his world spoke about with a reverence usually reserved for weaponry. He picked up his phone, opened her name, stared at it. He had not called her, had not sent a message, had instructed Marco not to surveil her, an instruction that had cost him more restraint than any business negotiation in his life, because Dante Marcello's first instinct with anything he wanted to control was to watch it. But he had not called, because calling meant admitting that the silence was unbearable, and admitting it was unbearable meant admitting that she had been the most essential person in his life for 3 years, and he had treated her like furniture. His thumb hovered. He put the phone face down on the desk, stood, walked to the window. He could see his reflection in the glass, dark suit, set jaw, the posture of a man who controlled rooms. And for the first time in his adult life, he looked at that reflection and felt not power, but an exhaustion so deep it had no bottom. He thought of the morning she made him coffee and sat across from him reading, not talking, not demanding anything, just there, quiet and warm, a kind of presence he had never known how to name and so had never named at all. He thought of the last board meeting where an associate had made a comment that edged toward disrespect about her, and Dante had silenced it immediately. Not out of love, he had told himself then, but out of pride. His wife would not be disrespected. He saw now that was a lie. It had been love. It had always been love. He had simply been too afraid to call it that, because love was the only thing in his world that he could not protect with power or money or violence. Love was the one vulnerability that no empire could wall off. And so he had destroyed it from the inside. To feel safe. The glass fell from his hand. Not thrown. Not slammed. Fell. The way a man's defenses fall when he finally stops fighting the truth. He slid into his chair, pressed both hands over his face, and made a sound in that empty office that he had not made since Palermo, since the alley, since his brother. A sound that had no name except grief. Marco Vitali had been with Dante Marcello since before the empire had its current shape. He had watched Dante negotiate with killers and never blink. Had seen him absorb the assassination of his closest allies and emerge from the funeral already strategizing. Had seen him make decisions that lesser men would spend lifetimes regretting, and carry them without visible weight. In 9 years, Marco had never seen Dante Marcello lost. He was lost now. The signs were subtle, because Dante was Dante. He would rather collapse internally than show structural damage publicly. But Marco saw it. The untouched meals. The redundant signatures on documents he'd already reviewed. The way he stood at windows now, not with the strategic survey of a general reading terrain, but with the emptiness of a man who had nothing left to calculate. He was not running his empire. He was haunting it. Marco said nothing. For weeks, nothing. Because Dante did not respond well to emotional confrontation. He locked up, went colder, and the conversation became a wall instead of a door. But on a Thursday evening, when Dante dismissed the entire staff and sat alone in the dining room, eating nothing and staring at a chair across the table, Marco sat down. Uninvited. Dante looked at him. What? His voice was flat. Professional. Marco placed a single photograph on the table. Not surveillance. Not a threat assessment. It was a photograph from 18 months ago, taken at a Marcello fundraising gala by a press photographer who had captured what neither of them had staged or intended. Dante and Amara, standing near the garden terrace. She was saying something. He was looking at her, not at the room, not at the assembled power around them. At her, with an expression so openly human that it had survived every wall he had ever built. Dante looked at the photograph for a long time. Where did you get this? I've had it for a year. Marco's voice was steady. I was going to give it to her. As a gift. Then the papers were signed, and I didn't. He tapped the edge of the photograph. You look like that every time you forgot to be careful, Dante. Every time your guard slipped. Silence. She didn't leave because she stopped loving you, Marco said quietly. She left because she was tired of loving a man who refused to let her see him love her back. Dante said nothing. Marco stood, straightened his jacket. She's still in New Orleans. I know because I check. Not because you asked me to, because she matters. He walked to the door. The rest is your decision. Dante Marcello wrote 4 letters. He destroyed the first 3. The first was too formal, the language of contracts and clauses, the only emotional vocabulary he had been trained in. He read it back and heard a man negotiating, not a man confessing. He burned it. The second was worse. It tipped into something that felt like emotional leverage. like he was listing his suffering as currency she should accept in exchange for returning. He burned that faster. The third was an apology so stripped of self that it said nothing. Just the bones of regret without the muscle of truth. He held it over the flame for a long time before letting it go. The fourth one he wrote at dawn, after a sleepless night, with the city turning gray outside and the photograph Marco had given him propped against the lamp. He did not plan it. He simply wrote. He wrote about Palermo, about his brother, about the decision he made at 19 that cost him the ability to feel safely. He wrote it plainly, not as an excuse, but as the only honest explanation he had for the man he had become. He wrote about the morning she rearranged the kitchen and how he had noticed immediately, but said nothing, because acknowledging that she had improved his world would have required acknowledging how much he needed her in it. He wrote about the boardroom, about what his instinct to protect her had actually been. He wrote, I told myself I didn't know how to love you. That was a lie. I knew. I was afraid. Those are different things, and you deserve to know the difference. He wrote, you walked out with your dignity entirely intact. I want you to know that I have never admired anything more in my life. He wrote, I am not writing to ask you to return. I am writing because you spent 3 years being seen incompletely, and I owe you the truth of being seen fully, even now, even like this. He wrote, you were right. I hope I learned to be the kind of man who deserves what you offered me. Whether that man ever reaches you is not the point. Becoming him is. He sealed it, handed it to Marco without a word. Marco asked no questions. He simply drove to the airport. Amara was on the porch when the car pulled up. She didn't recognize it. Not Marcello cars, not Marcello plates. A single man in a dark coat, someone she half recognized from events. He handed her an envelope with quiet efficiency and left without waiting for a response. She stood holding it for a long time. Her grandmother appeared at the screen door, said nothing, disappeared back inside. Amara sat down, turned the envelope over. Her name in Dante's handwriting, deliberate, architectural, the handwriting of a man who treated even letters as structures to be built correctly. She opened it, read it once, sat completely still, read it again. The third time, she read slowly, the way you read something you want to feel fully rather than just understand. When she finished, she folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands, staring at the street. She felt many things simultaneously, the way honest emotional moments do not arrive as single notes, but as chords, complicated, layered, resonant. She felt the satisfaction of being finally, truly seen. She felt grief for the 3 years he could have offered this and chose not to. She felt something that was not forgiveness yet, but was perhaps the precondition for it. A softening. A recognition that the man who wrote this letter had done something that the man she married did not know how to do. He had knelt. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. She thought of what her grandmother said about her grandfather. About the second time. About really asking. She thought of herself. This woman who was already all right. Already whole. Already rebuilding something beautiful from the space his absence had cleared. She thought about what she wanted. Not what he needed. Not what love required. What she wanted. She sat with that question for a long time. Then she went inside and cooked dinner with her grandmother, and laughed at something small and ordinary, and let the letter sit on the table, not answered, not discarded, simply present, the way certain truths need to be lived with before they can be decided. The change in Dante Marcello was not dramatic. It did not arrive with announcement. No public conversion. No theatrical gestures that empire men sometimes mistake for evidence of transformation. It arrived quietly, the way dawn arrives, not all at once, but incrementally, until you look up and realize the darkness is gone. He started with the things closest to him. He called his mother for the first time in 4 years, a relationship he had let go cold after his father's empire collapsed, because she had been caught in the wreckage of that collapse, and he had not known how to stay near grief without becoming dangerous. The call lasted 47 minutes. He said things he had stored in silence for a decade. He sat with Marco one evening and said, I owe you an acknowledgement. You've shown more loyalty than I've ever directly thanked you for. Marco had been visibly uncertain how to respond. Dante understood. He had never spoken that way. He let Marco be uncertain. It was honest. He stopped using coldness as a management strategy, began replacing distance with directness, found, to his own surprise, that his people responded not with reduced fear, but with increased loyalty. That there was a kind of authority that did not require intimidation. That he had been confusing fear for respect for over a decade. He read, not strategy, not financial reports. He read things Amara had left on the nightstand. Books he had always regarded with the indifference of a man who believed psychology was for the weak. He read them slowly, at night, in the quiet of the penthouse that was still empty but was slowly becoming less suffocating. He was not doing these things to win her back. He was doing them because the letter he wrote, the fourth one, the true one, had cracked something open in him. And he had discovered, with the stunned confusion of a man encountering something entirely new, that the person emerging from that crack was someone he could actually stand to be. For the first time since he was 18 years old, Dante Marcello was not building an empire. He was building himself. He had no idea whether it was too late. He worked on it anyway. 3 months after she left, Amara came back to the city. Not to him. Not to the penthouse. She had accepted a commission, a significant one, the redesign of a historic building downtown, the kind of project she had been working toward before her life became Mrs. Marcello. She rented an apartment in a neighborhood she had always loved, hired a small team, started work. She had not responded to the letter. She had also not discarded it. It had traveled back from New Orleans in her bag, tucked between the pages of one of the books she'd reread that month. She was not sure what that meant. She was not sure she needed to know yet. The city felt different to her now, or perhaps she felt different inside it. The skyline was the same. The noise was the same. But she moved through it as herself, not as an extension of a man's world, not as a Marcello. And that simple fact had the quality of something recovered rather than something lost. She ran into Dante on a Thursday, not engineered. The city, despite its enormity, has the occasional mercilessness of small towns in the lives of people whose stories aren't finished. She was leaving a cafe. He was arriving. They stopped. No guards. No performance. Just two people in a city they both occupied. He looked different, not weakened. Something quieter than weakness. Something that required more courage than strength. He said, "You look well." She said, "I am." A pause that held everything neither of them said. "I'm not here to ask you anything," he said. "I want you to know that." She looked at him the way she had always looked at him. Directly, without performance, seeing clearly. "I know," she said. Another pause. "The building on Archer Street," he said. "The commission. I heard. You'll do extraordinary work." Something moved across her face. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. "Thank you, Dante." She walked past him. He did not follow. He stood outside the cafe and watched her go, not with the possessive surveillance of the man he used to be, but with the still, open ache of a man who has learned that some things cannot be controlled, only honored. She turned a corner. He exhaled. And for the first time in his life, Dante Marcello let someone he loved walk away from him freely, without reaching after them. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. It was also, he understood as he stood there in the ordinary morning air, the truest. They did not end the way love stories usually end. There was no dramatic reunion. No rain-soaked confession on a grand staircase. No moment where the empire crumbled spectacularly and she caught him. What happened was quieter, more honest. Over months, they existed in the same city, separately, fully, authentically. There were 2 more encounters. Brief, dignified. The kind of exchanges between people who have loved each other genuinely and are learning what that love looks like when it is no longer organized around one person's fear. She finished the Archer Street building. It was extraordinary. The city spoke about it. He sent a single message the morning the project was announced. 4 words. "I knew you would." She read it on her porch, her own porch now, in an apartment full of her choices, and held the phone for a long moment. Then she wrote back. 2 words. "Thank you." That was not an ending. It was not a beginning. It was something more difficult and more meaningful than either. 2 people, both transformed, standing at the honest edge of what might still be possible, without pretense, without fear, without the old power structures that had made love impossible. Whether they found their way back to each other is a story still being lived. But here is what is true. She left whole. He chose to grow. And the empire, that cold, glittering, powerful thing, continued to stand. But the man inside it had finally learned that the most dangerous thing he could do was not to love. It was to keep pretending he didn't. If this story moved something in you, subscribe. Because every story on this channel is built to make you feel something real. And this one, it only gets deeper from here. Tell me in the comments, did Dante deserve a second chance? Or did Amara make the right choice by choosing herself first?